My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody. On today's episode, I have Ryan Howard from the Rollin podcast. We cover a handful of topics today, such as narrative versus mechanics, the rule of cool, and a little bit about how far you should push some of those things versus just sticking with the mechanics of the game. We end up talking about a handful of games such as 5th edition D&D, Savage Worlds, Dungeon Crawl Classics, and a handful of other books, and some of the tools Ryan has gained from those systems. And there's also a neat critical mechanic that we end up talking about that would help deal with some of that hit point bloat that we know and love from Dungeons & Dragons. And to wrap the episode up, we talk about his podcast, Rolling Bones, which is a live show that takes place on Monday nights at 8 p.m. Central Time. Ryan was kind enough to invite me as a guest on this coming Monday's episode, the 18th, and that can be found on twitch.tv, and I will include a link in the description. If you're interested in being on the show, don't forget you can join the Discord server. That's one of the best ways to get a hold of me. Otherwise, you can also hit me up on Twitter, or maybe you know a Dungeon Master that you would like to have interviewed, in which case you should hit them up and hit me up, and we can hopefully get something scheduled. And without further ado, let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everybody. I have Ryan Howard with me today from the Rollin podcast. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Great to have you. Ryan, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started in the tabletop role-playing space?
Gotcha. So I got into role-playing when I was in college. I started out super late in the hobby. I always was around tabletop gaming. I played Warhammer 40K. I bought comics, so I'd see people playing Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder in the comic shops that I would go to. But I never really got into it myself until college. I was a theater student, and I took a look at some of the role-playing sessions that were available online. People are going to make fun of me for saying this, but seeing the Big Bang Theory episode where they play D&D, I was like, they're acting. That's acting. It's acting and rolling dice. And so I immediately thought, this sounds like it's for me. I want to give this a try. And so I found a guy in my area who was running 5th edition. I told him I was interested, and I played my first session of Dungeons and Dragons, and the rest from there is history.
And did you say, was that 5th edition D&D?
Yeah, this was late 2014, early 2015, so it was right there at the beginning of 5th edition.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I also got into role-playing games kind of in college, except when I got into it, I didn't have anybody to teach me how to play. I just kind of went out and bought a book and started making other people play with me. So
I was always confused about how to get into it. None of my friends were into it at that point, so I had to rely entirely on Reddit r/LFG to get connected with that first group, which I only gamed with for 2 sessions, and then to get connected with my other group, which I ended up gaming with for 3 years.
And what do you end up playing mostly now? Is it still 5th edition?
Yes, it's a lot of 5th edition and a lot of Savage Worlds as well. And I've gotten into one second. Sorry about that. I've gotten into several other game systems like some OSR stuff like Dungeon Crawl Classics. That's probably my favorite system right now. But as far as what I get to actually play on a regular basis, it's 5th edition and Savage Worlds.
Sure. And do you end up being a player mostly, or do you end up running most of the games?
Up until recently, I was a forever GM. I am in a weird point in my life where I am playing in more games than I'm running. I'm only running 1 game right now, and I'm playing in technically 2. Yeah, but for the most part, I am usually it's on me to run a game if I want to play a game.
Yep, I know the feeling there. When you're prepping a game, what is like the first couple of things that you do in order to get ready for a session?
So, what I like to do, and this is stolen directly from Matt Colville. He is one of the kind of foundational figures in how I became a better GM. Uh, I like to basically write up some kind of design document or like elevator pitch for my game. So I kind of type out the main conflict the players are going to initially find themselves in, give them some information about the world that they're going to be playing in, and then submit that to the players and say, what do you guys think of this? Does this sound like fun to you?
And then from there, you can kind of tailor things, I assume.
Yeah. Yeah, from there, once you get people excited about the world, give them a little bit of information. At that point, a lot of players that I play with generally start coming up with elaborate backstories or start trying to fit different character builds that they've made into the world that you create. Some don't even try to fit them into the world. That's always an interesting conversation. But, usually with a lot of the players that I play with, all it takes is just that little push of circumstances that you're going to find yourselves in. And a lot of times, the kinds of people who gravitate towards this hobby will immediately pick up on something like that and go, yeah, I know what I want to do here, or I've got an idea of what I want to do here.
Right, the gears start turning, and then it's only a matter of time before you've got a fully fleshed out character.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I find that when you give players that degree of information, um, they start to find little weird places in the world that they can kind of like carve out their own space in. So the best example I can think of is my Nighthaven game, which I'm running on Rollin Bones once a month. It's a city based crime game with fifth edition. And when I brought that up to the players, they immediately were like, one of them wanted to be a tinkerer. One of them started talking about, like being a warlock who made a pact with an enchanted firearm because it's a setting that had guns in it. Uh, all kinds of great stuff just from like little pieces of information. Uh, a lot of times that'll get players just imaginations running wild, and sometimes even have to reel them back in. But
Sometimes all you need is a little bit of a seed because just coming up with a straight character with no, when it's like super open ended, it can be hard to kind of settle on something. But once you have that seed of, oh, this is kind of the theme we're going for, or here's some limitations that you guys have, let's build something in that, then it can be a little bit easier to start putting together those pieces for a character.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And do you have any tips for running the game when you're at the table?
Uh, as far as like creating scenarios that will get players engaged, or like what kind of
Whatever kind of advice or tips or tricks or anything that you maybe picked up somewhere and just kind of do frequently, or it's like a habit at your table, something that makes running the game easier for you. Just could be anything.
yeah, I mean, one thing that's really going to make your players feel better about your game is if you de-emphasize strict following of mechanics in favor of what's going to be fun or what's going to create a cool moment or allow a player to think outside the box, provided they meet a set of criteria. So I'll use fifth edition as an example. Fifth edition is a lot of people treat it as like a closed system. So if, for example, your rogue wants to, instead of attacking with his rapier, he wants to jump off the balcony, grab a hold of the chandelier, and do a swinging kick into the villain's chest in the middle of like a dinner party. There are GMs, and I've been this GM before, who are looking at the fifth edition book, going, "I don't know what damage you'd roll for that, or how you facilitate that. I don't I don't know how you're going to do that. Just can you think of something else? But if you think on your feet, and if you're willing to, kind of improvise with people, um, in that moment, someone comes up with a cool idea, and you say, "Okay, that sounds acrobatic. Make me an acrobatics check, and then roll to hit." And if you hit, you're going to deal a D8 damage, and you'll knock him prone, or something like that. Um, Definitely don't get so bogged down in the mechanics, and definitely think more about narratively what's going to be interesting here. Not mechanically what is exact rules is written in this book, but narratively what's going to be a great moment that you would see in a fantasy movie.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know a lot of the listeners, or at least the people that I've talked with on this podcast, um, it seems like there's a tendency to lead towards some of the more narrative games than D&D, kind of for that reason, right? Because they can get it's easier to do some of those cool things in those more narratively focused games when you have GMs that will kind of roll things to a stop with mechanics. So I like to see, like you said, to just improvise it. And I guess if I could throw my 2 cents in there in that situation, I would probably have the character just roll whatever their original damage would have been if they had just attacked them with a sword, basically, or whatever their like primary weapon is, unless there was some like really big circumstances why they shouldn't do that, like they have like a battle axe or something that does like a ridiculous amount of damage.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a balancing act. It's always a balance of when does the rule of cool, as people like to say it, go too far? And I've definitely been cautious in the past about letting stuff get way out of hand, because I mean, one of the players that I played with when I was first learning how to play, he would always kind of go for the power game options. He was the guy who wanted the cloak of invisibility and the boots of flight, so that he could fly around the battlefield without being seen and drop fireballs on people. He wanted to turn himself into a stealth bomber. And the DM, to his credit, was like, "I'm not giving you that combination of items. It's just not going to happen." And what this player would always lean on is, "But it would be so cool." And what you have to realize as a GM is what would be so cool for one player might make things less fun for other players or for you, because you now have to deal with the fact that because of decisions you as the GM made, you have a stealth bomber that you're having to balance encounters against.
The imagery of a stealth bomber in a fantasy game is hilarious. Yeah, I can see where, and that kind of comes back to uh, anytime you do say yes to something, you may be setting a precedent that this can always happen in the future. So you do kind of got to be clear as to what circumstances are maybe allowing you to take a certain action. Like the chandelier thing is kind of a, I mean, it's there's just not going to be chandeliers and ledges in every room that you're in, so it's kind of a one-off thing. But handing out magic items may be a different story.
Yeah, and that's something that has made the visual aspect of role playing kind of a big emphasis for me recently. I used to be strictly theater of the mind, because when I started, I was a college student who couldn't afford miniatures or terrain or anything like that. And so I was just like, who needs that? We don't need that stuff. But when you have room design, and I've seen this where the one of the guys that I gamed with in the past, he had a huge terrain collection, and so when I would run games for that group, he'd say, "What do you want the room to look like?" And I would give him a rough idea, let him kind of fill in the gaps of my rough idea, and a lot of times unexpected things in the combat would happen due to the way that the room layout was presented, or I would change certain details of what the players saw based on the layout of the room, or unique features that this guy would put out on the table. So having some kind of visual reference that again gets the players thinking, okay, I see a fireplace over there. Could I potentially, at risk to my own well-being, grab a log out of the fire and smack the necromancer with it so that his robes catch on fire? And again, you as the GM on the fly will need to be like, okay, make me a constitution save to hold on to the hot log, roll the attack. He's going to get a save. If he fails, he catches on fire.
Right. And really at the end of the day, especially for just about any tabletop RPG, the base mechanic is rolling a check, right? I mean, you can pretty much you maybe want to be careful, but anything that happens, if you don't have a mechanic for it, then find a stat and tell somebody to make a check, and you can pretty much handle most things in that way.
Mhm. And one thing that I like to do, again, this is a borrowed concept. I think I heard Matt Colville mention it once, and I also my friend Tim from the Knights and Nerds podcast, he's brought this up several times. Uh, if you can allow your players to make a case why a specific stat that their character may be skilled in could fit for a certain check, uh, at that point, again, you have the players using their brains to affect the world around you, which is something that I like to encourage in my games. And so, allowing players within reason to make a survival check instead of an athletics check to get away from a giant spider chasing them through the forest. That is something that I would consider, a valid switching of stats if, let's say, your ranger didn't pay too much attention to the athletics in creating his character. Uh,
Sure.
yeah, situations like that, if you can make a good case for why it should be a different stat, I'm willing to listen to that, and I'm willing to let you roll based on that.
Have you ever, I think it's an optional rule. Have you ever had them roll checks where like intimidation, for example, is charisma, but like if you're gonna like threaten to beat somebody up, sometimes I've seen people run it as like a strength intimidation check. Do you ever kind of switch uh the baseline like stat that they use?
I don't do that in fifth edition because fifth edition has the handy mechanic of advantage. So in that way, if you've got like a big barbarian who's not very charismatic and he wants to intimidate someone, if he says, I'm gonna slam him up against the wall and yell in his face, uh, as I'm making my intimidation check, I'd probably grant him advantage.
Sure. Yeah, which is probably about the same effect without having to get into the math of actually switching stats and figuring out proficiencies and stuff. So I can see that being just a much easier option. And it's always fun to roll more dice, anyways.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And you said that you play Savage Worlds as well. I haven't really talked to anybody that's really played much Savage Worlds or run much Savage Worlds. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, so for anyone who's not familiar, Savage Worlds is a setting agnostic game system from Pinnacle Entertainment Group. And its core mechanics are not just built around dice, but also around a deck of cards and poker chips. So initiative is handled by a deck of cards, and players can use poker chips to re-roll bad rolls or to get rid of wounds if they get hurt. There's all kinds of things you can do with those chips. But the other kind of main thing around it is instead of rolling a d20 and adding a modifier, the more skilled you are in a particular skill or the higher attribute that you have associated with a particular skill, you get a higher dice type, all the way up to a d12. So someone with an average skill in something would be rolling a d4 with no modifier, and someone who's extremely skilled would be rolling a d12 with no modifier. And the other interesting aspect is with every roll, you're also rolling a d6, which is called the wild dice, which represents, you know, the fact that any fool can get lucky doing something one time. And if you roll the highest number on your dice, that dice explodes and you get to roll it again. And if you get that high number, you get to roll it again and again until you stop rolling that high number.
I think I've seen a little bit of Savage Worlds in a YouTube show that I watched a while back. It was a solo. It was a solo show. Me, myself, and Die. I don't know if you've heard of that or familiar with it. That's pretty much the only exposure I have to the Savage World system because I believe that's what he used in his first season.
Gotcha. I'm not familiar with that show, but I mean, Savage Worlds is a great system for small groups. It's perfectly usable for large groups, although there's a certain limit on how large a group you can get really with any role playing game. But yeah, I mean, it's a great system. It's got a lot of great settings for it. My personal favorite is Deadlands, which is a Weird West game. Basically, it's the Wild West, but there are steampunk machines, and the undead are walking around, and there's all kinds of crazy monsters and weird stuff going on. Um, but you can play pirates, you can play fantasy. There's superhero games. Your options are unlimited when it comes to what you can do with Savage Worlds, which is one of the things that I really like about it.
Is that the main reason that you would gravitate towards that over, say, fifth edition?
Yeah, if I wanted to run something other than medieval fantasy, I would go to Savage Worlds before fifth edition. There are uh, rules for like modern games with fifth edition. I've got a book called Spaceships and Star Worms, which is a sci-fi companion that kind of beefs up fifth edition's capabilities for sci-fi. My good friend Todd Moonbounce has he plays a lot of Star Wars fifth edition, which is fifth edition with a Star Wars lean to it. But when it comes to anything that's not medieval fantasy, I do think Savage Worlds is kind of a better solution there.
Are there any like things after having run Savage Worlds? Are there any things that you learned from playing that system that maybe bleed into some of your GMing when you run other games?
Yeah, the big thing from Savage Worlds that I like is rewarding players for good actions. So in Savage Worlds, the GM has bennies, poker chips. And if a player role plays well or does, something well like that, it's very common for the GM to give a player a Benny. And I know that fifth edition has inspiration, but so many GMs forget about inspiration. Uh, it does take like some conditioning to reward players for coming up with creative solutions, and I think Savage Worlds does that really well because of how integral the mechanic of using your poker chips is in the mechanics of the game.
Sure. So when you're running like fifth edition or something, then do you hand out like poker chips as like inspiration, or how does that bleed over?
I probably will start doing that next time I'm running a regular game in person. Um, but I mean, what that would take the form of in fifth edition is just not being afraid to give someone advantage if they're thinking of something cool and unexpected, like the chandelier situation. If no guards have been alerted to the fact that the party is sneaking into this big event, and the rogue sees the big bad standing over in the corner, and he sees the chandelier, and he's like, I could do this, and he wouldn't see it coming. I'd be like, yeah, roll that with advantage.
Sure. So it's just being a little bit more proactive in your GMing style and kind of enabling your players to do cool things, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
For combat in D&D, when you're like prepping for combat? Do you prep a ton of stats and stuff, or do you do some of that on the fly, or what is that process for you? Because I know that D&D combat can kind of be a lot sometimes. It can be slow.
Mm. Yeah, so I'm still kind of trying to figure out ways to make combat less clunky in fifth edition. I've gotten a few good ideas from some people that I know. One guy, Venger Satanis, who I've had on the show a few times. He's got this mechanic that he put out on Kickstarter not too terribly long ago called Crimson Escalation, where the crit range for attacks increases for both sides of the combat as combat goes. So first round, you crit on a 20, second round, it's a 19 or a 20, 18 or 20, 17 or 20. And then if you're a fighter or barbarian with an increased crit range, yours would increase even more.
Sure. So you're just the longer combat goes, the more likely it is you're going to take a lot of damage or deal a
Yes,
lot of damage.
absolutely.
Inversely.
Yeah, it's that representation mechanically of when you enter battle, the longer it goes, the more your luck tends to run out, and the more like fatigue would set in as you're continuously swinging a sword. Because there's nothing worse than 5 rounds in a row where the only person who hits is the wizard who has run out of spells and is hitting things with a quarterstaff at that point, dealing a d6 damage. And you're like, well, he's hitting, and the monster's not hitting any of you. But this guy's dealing an average of like 3 damage per round, and it's almost time to end the game, and you're fighting a beholder. So can we find a way to expedite this situation? Can one of you roll well?
So I assume that really ups the tension in any battle, right? Because the longer it goes on, you're going to get into like scary numbers in terms of damage if you take a hit.
Yeah, and I think that kind of solves the hit point problem. Because a lot of the reason why 5e takes so long in combat is the fact that players and monsters have so darn many hit points. And there are great resources out there that help you kind of reduce that. Hanker and Fernell has a great book called 5e Hardcore Mode for anyone who wants to find ways to brutalize 5th edition and make it a lot easier for things to kill you and kill your players. 5e Hardcore Mode is good, but with something like Crimson Escalation, it almost doesn't matter how many hit points you have once you're 4 rounds in, and anyone rolling at that point like a 16 or 17 or better is going to be critting.
Right. Yeah. Well, the nice thing about that is then you're not. That's a pretty simple rule to introduce that kind of reduces the need for you to have other rules or monster creation or trying to edit how much stuff your players have versus the monsters or any of that. It's just one rule. It's easy to remember, and then it significantly reduces character and monsters hit points, at least how long they have them.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
That's funny because we actually had a conversation on last week's episode about that exact thing, about the D&D having a little bit of hit point bloat, and just the first couple rounds can be fun, and then like the last couple rounds can be fun, and then in the middle there's just kind of like people are just whacking on each other, just kind of waiting. But I like that. I like the critical mechanic.
Yeah, and one of the episodes that you had, and I can't remember who it was you were talking to, but you guys mentioned having it was Unmade Gaming. That's who you were talking to, mentioning having the monster out there for basically just as long as it's fun.
Yes, yeah, and just when it narratively makes sense to remove a monster from combat. Goblins don't need to stick around for too long if they get bonked. Other things maybe should stick around a little bit longer, especially. The couple games of D&D that I've run, it seems like the players usually get some lucky hits, and it's like, okay, here's my Big Bad, and we're 2 rounds in, and he is completely out of health.
Mhm. Yeah, and that comes around to when it comes to the big bad, you should never have a big bad fight where it's just him by himself, no matter how powerful he is, because action economy is always going to catch up with you in that situation. You need to have some minions out there, if nothing else, just to keep the big bad alive for a few more rounds so that the combat lasts a little bit and isn't anticlimactic.
That was my very first time running D&D. I ran a one shot, and that was exactly what happened. I just had, Big Bad Necromancer, and that was it. And then he just got plowed over pretty quick. It was like 3 rounds. So
But there's a great resource online called "The Monsters Know What They're Doing." It's put out by a guy named Keith Amon. He's got a book out by the same name, and it's just an explanation of each monster in the monster manual, what kind of behavior they would have, what attacks that are on their stat block they would go for in certain situations, and how long they would typically stand by a fight, or how they would act if you encountered one in the wild versus if you cornered one in its lair.
right, because if you corner something, and especially if it's cornered and injured, or corner and has uh, others around, it's going to act very differently than, if it takes some damage out in the wild, it might just turn and run, depending on what kind of creature it is. Can you actually talk a little bit more about Dungeon Crawl Classics? Because I've heard that name come up before, but I have not actually read it or really seen much on it before.
Yeah, definitely. So, Dungeon Crawl Classics was put out by Goodman Games, a great game company. They also do Mutant Crawl Classics, which is a like post-apocalyptic flavor of the same game, and it's basically a fusion of all that people seem to really love about old school uh, 70s era RPGs with some of the newer ideas. So you've got fewer hit points for a lot of player options. Like your class would be elf. Elf is not a separate race. Your class is an elf. Your class is dwarf. Your class is halfling. And then there's warrior, mage, and thief. But there's also new school ideas like ascending armor class, so you're not having to calculate THACO. And you have a mechanic called luck. It's one of your starting stats, and you can wager that luck to improve the outcomes of your dice rolls. And it has a super awesome magic system where you can burn your physical and mental stats to enhance the power of your spells. So it's like some Jack Vance, really crazy wizards like cutting their hand to boost the power of a magic missile, which is determined by a dice roll. Every time you cast a spell, there are no spell slots, but you cast a spell, roll a d20, and then compare your result to a table, which determines kind of the outcome of the spell, which could mean you blow someone's head off, or it could mean you lose the spell forever.
It just sounds like it's a lot more intense.
It is, but mechanically it's very breezy, very, minimal. It's designed to create a brutal challenge that players will have to solve not just with the rule book and the character sheet, but with the rule book, the character sheet, and their brains.
Sure, so it kind of forces them to come up with creative solutions.
Yep. Yeah, and it embraces the notion that role-playing games aren't about overcoming every single obstacle from beginning to end. They're about surviving until you can overcome.
And I think earlier in the episode you mentioned that this is kind of your favorite system right now.
Oh yes. Yeah, this is definitely my favorite system right now.
And what is it that draws you to the system?
It's this idea of earning heroism. So, for all the good about 5th edition, a first level 5e character is pretty powerful already. you have a lot of power right out of the gate in 5e, and a lot of players will come to the table with a character who's already been adventuring before they show up with this first level character. So what Dungeon Crawl Classics does is it takes you literally from farm to adventuring with its funnel. That's another thing that I forgot to mention about DCC. There's a funnel that you go through where you start with a like basic profession, be it farmer, banker, scribe, nobleman, city guard, and you have to go through an adventure where if you survive, you then become an adventurer and you then get to pick your class. So instead of starting somewhere in the middle of your career and being super powerful, you're starting at the very beginning. You're coming straight off of the farm, straight out of the guards barracks, and having to prove that you can survive long enough to maybe someday have a bard song about you.
Sure, that almost the imagery that I got from that was just like you're the Luke Skywalker or the Harry Potter, where they don't when we first meet them in their story, they are kind of nobody at that time.
Yeah,
But then
absolutely.
they go through that and kind of initiation, and if they make it, then they come out on the other end, you know, much better than they were before.
Yeah, and that's classic fantasy. I mean, that's the story of both Bilbo and Frodo Baggins.
Right. The hero's journey, as they call it in storytelling, usually.
Yep. Yep.
But yeah, that just I'll have to look into that one too. So many RPG books that I need to read. But I hearing you talk about it, it just sounds really cool, and I like some of those more um, gritty or where things are just a little bit more dire, maybe.
Making things a lot more difficult. Definitely check out 5e hardcore mode from Runehammer Games. I mentioned it once before, but it basically kind of brings some of those mechanics in that makes the game more challenging and makes it feel a little bit more like there's something at stake every time you enter combat. But Hanker Infernal's a great guy. I've had him on the show a couple times. Uh, and 5e hardcore mode is a fantastic book for anyone who hasn't picked it up yet.
And for anybody that's listening, he's also the author of ICRPG, which I know has been mentioned before on the podcast. So if you haven't heard his actual name, then connecting the dots there a little bit. That's really cool that you had him on your show. I would love to talk to him.
Yeah, he's a fantastic guy. You should definitely reach out to him. He has this kind of crazy punk rock sensibility about him. But the way his mind works is, fantastic. And some of the stuff that he comes up with, some of the stuff that he's thinking about, the notebooks that he builds based on role playing games, he showed them on stream one time, and it's stuff like here's rules that you could potentially use in mass combat next to like a recipe for hot sauce and stuff like that. So he's out there, but he's out there in like the best possible way. He really is a great role playing mind.
I was following his stuff really closely when kind of his first and second version of ICRPG was coming out. I really like that system too, just for simplicity, and again, your health is low. Um, just really, to me, that's kind of like a streamlined version of D&D. Well, I think this might be a good time to transition and talk a little bit about Rollin' Bones and what you have going on over there.
Yeah, so Rollin' Bones is a weekly live show. I do it on Twitch, twitch.tv/RollinBonesRyan. We go live every Monday night at 8 p.m. Central, and it's usually one of three things, actually one of four things. Either I have a guest on who I'm interviewing, kind of like this, but instead of focusing on like game mastering tips, the conversations usually kind of go all over the place. depending on who I'm talking to. Sometimes it's stuff like this. Other times it's game design or why certain games aren't as popular as other games or the history of a particular company. Uh, the other things that I do are solo episodes where I just kind of talk about different topics that are a bee in my bonnet in a particular circumstance. Usually it's something that just makes me want to rant and go off, and so I'll talk about that for way too long. I review games. So anytime I back something on Kickstarter, I generally have a review of it once it arrives, or if a friend of mine has put something out, I'll review it. I'm pretty cool about looking at things and then reviewing them if audience members reach out to me with something they want to see talked about on the show. So if any of you have a game that I haven't reviewed that you want to see me review, definitely hit me up at Howard_Ryan Gregg on Twitter and Instagram, and I will review the product if I think it's something worth talking about. And the last thing I do is actual play with my Night Haven group. Once a month, we do an episode where we play Night Haven, which is a setting that I created. I'm hoping to publish it and publish the adventure that we're running at some point in the future. Fair warning for anyone out there who is not 18 or older, we do get into some grisly topics. The game is a crime game set in an urban setting, kind of focused around some magic students who were kidnapped. So there are some not safe for work, not safe for kids topics that are addressed in that particular game. Just as a warning for anyone who is interested in that particular aspect of things. Just know that going in.
And is that a live stream that you guys do every month then?
Yep. Yep, once a month. It's me, John, and Joe Page from Project Fullblade, which is an online RPG project where the rules are constantly being updated and tweaked. Rather than releasing a physical product, they just have kind of a living online product that's evolving and changing, basically to allow people to just play more fun role-playing games. And then Prax and Rez from the Gamertarians, which is a video game live stream where they're playing Rocket League.
I'm gonna have to check that out. One thing that always bums me out about all of the PDFs that I have collected is that they just don't read super great on your phone, and I just want it to be a website that just resizes nicely. So I like the idea of a RPG that is, or at least supports some sort of like a web version that's just easier to consume than PDFs on a phone screen.
Yep. And not just a constant gotcha trap like D&D Beyond.
Yeah, I've used D&D Beyond a little bit, but most of the first campaign I was in was before pandemic, so we didn't need any digital tools there. And then the second one that I was in, we pretty much did everything inside of Roll20. So I've vaguely messed around in D&D Beyond, but never gotten too far into it.
I wouldn't be so hard on D&D Beyond if they put codes for the D&D Beyond material in their physical books. And I know there are contract reasons why they can't do that, but I bought Dungeon Crawl Classics from Goodman Games at North Texas RPG Con, and I opened the book up, and right there is a code for the PDF version so that I've got both and don't have to pay for both. That kind of convenience is all I'm asking for from WotC, but they're not interested. They don't care.
Well, and that's kind of nice. A lot of stuff that you get off of Drive-Thru RPG, if they have a physical edition, usually there's a bundled edition that's like the same price as the physical, and you just get the PDF version included, which is always nice.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and, Kickstarter campaigns do it too. Everyone else has figured this out. They don't seem to be hurting for revenue. In as far as these companies keep putting products out, I don't know why Wizards decided to do it that way. Again, they're not missing any revenue, so I guess they're fine with it being a little bit inconvenient for their players. But I'm just saying, customer service wise, that seems like the smart move.
Speaking of online play, and I assume that your live stream especially uses some sort of a virtual tabletop.
We use Roll20 for Nighthaven, which is fine. Roll20 used to be super cool to me, but then playing in Deadlands the Hellgate trilogy, uh, our game master there, Cheyenne, he's using Foundry. And I don't know if you've heard of Foundry VTT, but it is unbelievable how customizable, how visually appealing, how amazing Foundry is as far as like creating an immersive experience for your players. You definitely pay for it. It costs like $50 for the license to use Foundry, but once you get the rules added in for whatever system you're using, it's great for Savage Worlds. I imagine it's great for D&D. But you've got so many options there at your fingertips to create like a really immersive game world. If you have the talent, the time, and the inclination to bring in those assets and have them populate the tabletop.
I've had other people mention it, and it seems to me like kind of a similar sentiment. If people who have used it, that seems to be their go-to. Um, I think the last person that I had talk about it mentioned that you can do like custom scripting and stuff inside of it. Um, so me being a software developer, I would probably get just sucked down the rabbit hole if I splurge on Foundry.
Yeah, if your background is in software development, then you would have a ball with Foundry. I'm not as technical as I'd like to be, so I haven't been able to get under the hood with Foundry just yet. At some point, I will, and I'll try to teach myself how to use it. But for people who are very like tech savvy and very artistic and really wanting to create that kind of experience for their players, Foundry is the way to go.
I'm gonna have to look into that some more. I've pretty much just used Roll20 just for familiarity and ease of use. But also the Owlbear Rodeo is kind of nice if you don't want to have some of the extra stuff that Roll20 has. You can just load up maps and tokens really quick in Owlbear without accounts, which is nice. That's the other one that I've used. Do
And
you? Oh, go ahead.
just for anyone who is using a virtual tabletop and you want to make maps pretty easily, Incarnate, INK Arnett, is a fantastic tool. Again, it's mostly free to use. If you want to pay the $15 a year for premium access, you get a whole bunch more features, but it's a great way to create those maps with kind of minimal expertise needed for your RPGs.
And speaking of maps, it sounded like you use maps quite frequently, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you end up making a lot of those maps, or do you find them online somewhere, or where do you get your maps from?
Generally, I make them. Every now and then I can find good ones online that I really like, or if it's last minute and I didn't get the chance to make a map, I can generally find something in the Roll20 store. But for the most part, I enjoy making my own maps because I get to stretch my imagination in that way and give the players some interesting details to latch on to.
That probably helps a little bit with streaming too. I know you can come into some conflicts there with whether or not it's okay to use certain maps if you don't have permission when you're streaming online.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. You want to make sure if you're streaming, you want to make sure it's something you purchased or you're giving credit where credit is due.
And your podcast is mostly a live show, but then you do have the episodes come out separately that you can listen to later, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. For anyone who can't make it on the night of the show, we put up the full episode on YouTube, and then we also put out an audio version on. I'm hosted on Anchor, just like you are here. So it's on Anchor, it's on Spotify, Google Podcasts. The whole every platform.
Yeah, I really enjoy using Anchor. It just has been a very smooth experience, and I really like that I don't have to pay for it.
Mhm. Oh yeah, yeah. Anchor was great. I used to do a music podcast where I would talk about the band Rush, one of my favorite bands of all time, and my co-host and I used Podbean for that, and we were paying for it. And when I discovered that you could just host a podcast on Anchor for free, I was like, "Oh, this is amazing."
Yeah, when I first started the podcast, that was one of the first things I was looking at was, okay, I gotta get podcast hosts somewhere, and I looked at a couple and I was like, okay, it's gonna be like a couple bucks a month, and then it was like, oh, Anchor, oh, it's free, oh, perfect, there's my winner.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Probably helps that Spotify owns them, so their revenues is not from Anchor, it's from having more stuff on Spotify, basically.
Yep. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, is there anything else that you would like to talk about, either role playing game related or about your podcast?
As far as like role playing games go, I really do want to encourage people to, definitely always stick with the game systems you love and the ones that your players are comfortable with. And I know for a lot of us, that's, fifth edition or, Pathfinder for kind of a smaller number of people. But I definitely want to encourage everyone to give other game systems a chance and see what they can do, because D&D, like my friend Stu Horvath always says, D&D is blue jeans. It's always going to be there. It never goes out of style. It's ubiquitous. But there are other game systems that do things a little bit differently, create a different feel, maybe capture a different type of gaming experience. So if your players want to keep playing but seem a little bit burnt out on the usual, definitely take a look at things like Dungeon Crawl Classics or Old School Essentials, uh, Savage Worlds. I love that system. Even stuff like Blades in the Dark. If you've got players that are constantly bugging you about like doing a heist session, check out something like that. But when it comes to systems, don't be afraid to stretch your legs a little bit and try something a little bit new. It's going to be a learning process for everyone at first, but you might discover something you love even more.
Do you want to just give one more kind of blurb of where people can find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Howard_Ryan Gregg. If you want to see the miniatures that I'm painting, Instagram's the place for you. I love to paint miniatures, and you'll find them on there. And for the show, it's live Monday nights at 8 p.m. Central at twitch.tv/RollinBonesRyan, or you can catch it on YouTube. Just look for Rollin Bones with Ryan Howard on YouTube. And you can search the same thing on the podcatcher of your choice if you aren't able to catch it on YouTube and just want to hear the audio.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on, Ryan.
No problem at all. This was a ton of fun.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. You can find links to all of the products and resources that we talked about on the show in the show notes. And if you'd like to join the community or find out how to be on the show, check out our subreddit or join us in our Discord server.